Thank you so much, Roopika Risam, for joining us today. You're the author of a book about post-colonialism and the digital humanities. Could you start by telling us a little bit about how would you define post-colonialism in a sort of digital humanities context?
Absolutely. Let me talk about this from my perspective, learning about post-colonial studies as a student when I was in my undergraduate studies. And I was really fascinated by the way that post-colonial scholarship was talking about the ways that writing and culture and even academic research played a role in supporting colonial projects. And so one of the core texts, for example, that I was introduced to when I was a college student was Edward Said's Orientalism, where he argues that scholars of the Orient or the East played a role in constructing a way of understanding the world for Europeans in which they were dominant and their culture was normative, and that everything else for him, the East, the Orient, in this case, he's talking about what we would call the Middle East today, is subordinate, is the other, the uncivilized, the uncultured, against which Europe could define itself as being the arbiters of culture. And so I was really captivated by this idea because no one had really ever talked to me in a class before about that particular dimension of power in relation to culture. And so that led me to later in my master's degree and then in my PhD to continue thinking about these questions of what role do scholars, as they are producing knowledge, have in maintaining social inequalities, whether it's at the level of colonialism or racism or sexism or where all those pieces intersect. So when I was working on my dissertation as a graduate student, I was struggling with trying to think about ways to articulate my research, which was looking at the way that ideas related to Black power had traveled and circulated throughout the post-colonial world, because there are a number of examples, like for example, the Dalit tigers in India, who've been greatly inspired by Black power and by the work of W. Du Bois. And what I found when I was doing research were all these connections. And they were connections that existed in different forms of media. I mean, sometimes they were in writing, but sometimes they were in things like the subscriber roles of the Black Panther newspaper, where you can see that their newspaper is circulating around the world in places you wouldn't even necessarily expect. And so what I was really thinking through was the fact that trying to write that all down on paper wasn't really helping me make the arguments that I wanted to make, that there was a limit to what I could write out. And so I had previously done some work in digital humanities in my master's program, because I was working at essentially what we would call a digital pedagogy center now. It wasn't at the time. And so I started thinking, well, you know what? We were thinking about all these ways that technology can help us teach or can help us think through research questions in the humanities. So I wonder if this thing that is called digital humanities potentially could help me with this precise problem of, I don't think I can visualize and articulate what I want to, and all these sort of multi-directional connections between people in different social movements on paper, but maybe digital humanities could help. So that's actually how I started doing digital humanities research. And what became very clear to me when doing that was the way that so much digital humanities work already focuses on the kinds of scholarship that has already been canonical, that has already been, you know, discussed at length, that has already been subject to a significant amount of scholarly attention. And what's happening as digital humanities scholarship does that is it just continues to reproduce those kind of colonialist and racist dimensions that are underneath knowledge production more generally. And so that's actually where my interest and this sort of idea of post-colonial digital humanities came from, which is to try to think about the ways that the kinds of practices that digital humanists engage with reproduce the inequalities of print scholarship. And I would say more than reproduce them, they're amplifying them, because we're putting this work online and we're making it available to so many people. And so if we're thinking about knowledge-seeking publics on the internet, if all we're doing is reproducing the power dynamics of print scholarship, then that's what they're going to find. And so it became really important to me to both try and do some work to uncover what are the practices that are contributing to this, and then also thinking through how are the ways that we can confront this.
So what would your advice be to a student just starting to work with digital humanities who might be building projects in the future? What should a young digital humanities scholar think about?
Yeah, I think there's a really important responsibility to be thinking through what are the power dynamics that are shaping their research design, the data they're using or the data they're collecting and creating, and then also be very clear about how they're situating their work. What is the scope of what they're doing? What's outside the scope? Why are you doing what you're doing, and why are you not doing what you're doing? And I think it's really about, you know, what kinds of critical ways that we can position the scholarship that we do to recognize the role of power in the work that we're doing. And I think generally print scholarship hasn't done that, and so it's not a practice that is necessarily a part of scholarly research, but I think it absolutely should be. It's sort of a, you know, this is the standpoint theory, right? Thinking through, you know, what you're doing, why, what are the influences on what you're doing, and locating that and situating that for your viewers, for your users, for your readers, so that you're illuminating what you're doing and where it stands in relation to the broader scope. So I was thinking about these issues in relationship to a project that I was working on with some students, in which we wanted to explore Pan-Africanism, so the social movement that was popular in sort of the first half of the 20th century, where people of African descent were thinking through what their common causes were, commonalities, and thinking about what political solidarity would look like and how it would benefit them, whether they lived in the US, they lived in a country at that time, a colony in Africa, or in a country in Europe or in the Caribbean. And so working on this project, you know, we were very excited. We thought, you know, throughout between 1900 and 1959, there were tons of events that happened where we would be able to potentially find lists of participants, see who these people were, maybe do a network analysis and look at what were the connections between them, and would we find that the nodes of the network were kind of the usual players like W. Du Bois or George Padmore that people think of and associate with Pan-Africanism, or maybe there are these other people who, you know, that might lead to further research questions into figures that are lesser known. So, you know, immediately the first problem we ran into is that there weren't any readily available data sets for us to use. This is one of the challenges doing the kind of work that I do, and I think one of the reasons that digital humanities has taken such a canonical approach, it's that, you know, if there's, for example, published work before 1924 is in public domain, which makes it a lot a lot of it's available already transcribed, or, it's in Project Gutenberg, or, there are easier ways to get access to the text to do what you would want with them with digital tools, whether it's, creating a data set, whether it's textual analysis, mapping, whatever it would be. We didn't have that, right? We were starting at scratch. And so we had to spend the first 6 months of the project just trying to do archival and secondary source research to identify what were these events and who was there. We were then, plagued with the fact that, a lot of this work hasn't been preserved, because what gets preserved in archives is itself a function of power and priorities and money, and who has access to all of these things. So we were able to get a good sense of how much we had found. So we would be able to find total numbers of attendees at an event. So we know like there were 495 people there. And then we would be able to gauge how much we had been able to find based on the total number. And in some cases, there were some events where we actually found 100% of the names of the attendees. And then there were some events where we had maybe 20, 30%. And so, these are the ways that these hallmarks of colonialism that have influenced the cultural record are then ones that we have to contend with as we're working to build a digital cultural record. And so, ultimately the project was not what we had expected, because what we found out was that there were so many events and most people just attended one. The person who attended the vast majority, or at least the highest number of them, was actually Du Bois. And that was not shocking. And so then we had to kind of pivot and think through, okay, our research question really didn't pan out. What is useful here? How can we make this data available? How can we make this data meaningful to people? Because what we thought was going to be the case didn't pan out. And so, thinking about then I think that project really illustrates a number of these challenges of doing work at the intersection of the post-colonial and digital humanities, because you're dealing with those like precise ways that colonialism has influenced knowledge production. And then when you go to try and do the digital version, there's so much you don't know, and there are things that you don't know. So like we knew what percentage of attendees in an event that we had found. And there's also so much we don't know. And sometimes the best questions are somewhere in what we don't know. So, our presumption had been that the network would help us understand Pan-Africanism better. And instead what happened is it didn't. And it led us to new questions like, what cannot be captured in a network analysis? What happens when that person who attended that one event went home? And what kind of research would we then need to do to understand the effects of these events outside of their time and place, and to think through that differently.
That's fascinating. I was also thinking about the what you said about digital humanities project often reifying, what the canon, and like in Norway, the Ibsen project was the first big one, of course, right? And I think it's often easier to get funding for that too, because it's there's still that sort of nation building sort of desire, oh, our national hero and so forth. But you're also saying that what's in the archive, like even if it's not some famous person like Ibsen, when you start looking in the archives to digitize the archives, what's in the archives is also not everything.
Mm-hmm. For
sure. So there's this representation. So as a digital humanities scholar, you should be thinking about what kinds of data you're collecting. Is it just repeating the canon? Is it looking for new things? Are there other aspects that one should also think about? I mean, one question I've been wondering about is whether the very idea of network analysis, as you said, or the database itself are problematic, like the structures of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets into kind of questions around epistemology in some respects. So, one of the main critiques of post-colonial studies, and I think this is a totally fair critique, is that it really comes out of a tradition of continental European philosophy. And, it's highly reliant on Marx, on the Frankfurt School, on Western theory. And I think that there's a challenge there that there are so many other routes and routes to knowledge. There are so many valuable knowledges that could be the basis of thought, and that in the context of post-colonial studies, they're not really. I mean, I find work on decoloniality to be very interesting as well, because they're trying to think through how do we understand these ideas while delinking from Europe. I find the work of Indigenous scholars to be very illuminating as well, as because when they're thinking about decolonization, for example, it's not only about what Ngugi wa Thiong'o would call decolonizing of the mind, but it's also about dispossession, and it's also about genocide. And in some ways, I've always felt like post-colonial theory focuses on the discursive to the exclusion of sometimes the material realities. And I think part of that comes out of the fact that post-colonial theory is often focused on countries that are now independent, right? So in a sense, decolonization happened. Now, decolonization being a process, I think we'd be hard pressed to find a place that we would say is legitimately decolonized.
What is decolonization really?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the question. I mean, fundamentally, I get really frustrated when people use decolonization as a metaphor for something like diversity. Eve Tuck and Kei Wayne Yang have a great article on this called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And I think that actually frustrates me a lot in the US, where people talk about decolonization, or actually England does this too, decolonize the curriculum. I'm sorry. I mean, yes, we need more equity, we need more inclusion in a curriculum, but that is not decolonization. That is not fundamentally changing the way people think. That is not thinking about how we can be redistributive. And so when you think about, independence, I'll say independence rather than decolonization, right? Independence in India is still encumbered by, for example, neocolonialism and reliance on other countries, reliance on corporations, multinational corporations. And we see this in countries in Africa as well, right? And so it's very hard to imagine what a fully autonomous state would even look like because of globalization and the ways that international relations are so encumbered, and that there are so many elements of dependence now. I mean, I think, for example, in the case of COVID and the COVID vaccines, and the way Brazil is being a site where vaccines are being tested, right? And in many ways, it's like, that's a way for Brazil to get in on getting vaccines if they're proven to be right, because they're not in the position to be engaging in vaccine development at the speed that, the US or Germany or the UK or China are doing. And so there is that, to me, this like ethical dimension of, testing out vaccines on a population of people who are vulnerable, who you can test them on, precisely because this is the only way this is like the quid pro quo for getting access to a vaccine, right? And so, I mean, I think about that as one example of a way that we could argue, decolonization as a process is something that, we're not there yet. And then, of course, that aside, we have the context in the US and in Canada, and also, I mean, in Central America and in South America as well, of indigenous people who've been dispossessed of land, who've been, mistreated, who live in disproportionately awful conditions. We're seeing in the case of the U.S., we're seeing, among, for example, the Navajo Nations, COVID rates were out of control in March and April. And then you had moments like some of the reservations in South Dakota were trying to, they put up roadblocks to stop people from coming in. And that became an issue in which the South Dakota state government was saying, you can't do that, right? And they're saying, no, this is our sovereign right to do that. And we're also protecting our community. And to me, these are the ways that, certainly in the context of indigenous people in the United States, they're still, they're still colonized.
Mm.
And so, in a way, I find that the ways that people use decolonization in this kind of like improve our schools or improve our curriculum or improve our university to be problematic, because it ignores the fact that there is a living, struggling population of people who live under colonialism here and now.
To round off, could I ask you about your background, your My Little Pony background in Zoom? Is it possible to connect that to digital humanities or to post-colonialism, or is it just fun?
My house is really messy.
Like most of us.
That's what it is.
Well, I love your unicorns and rainbows.
I love My Little Pony. My Little Pony, I mean, My Little Pony is great. Obviously when I was a child, I am a child of the 80s. So I, had My Little Pony when I was a kid. And then it so transpired that they rebooted My Little Pony with this series called Friendship is Magic. I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, 8 years ago. And it is this like feminist, pony power narrative of how friendship will see us through all the challenges. And this sounds really cute.
Brings a smile to my face anyway. Thank you so much, Roopika, for letting us talk a bit about your book.